Let's take a look at cloth thickness, adding some thickness and cloth to cloth collisions and how we make sure they happen the way we want or the way we expect, right? So if we look at this flow, I'm birthing three cloth planes and I've got three cloth planes and I'm turning them into cloth. And that's all these three events are. And the only reason they're broken out separately is so I can give each one a different material so that we can actually see each cloth and how it's interacting with the other. So red, yellow, blue, 1, 2, 3 on a multi-sub object. And here you can see my three planes before they're animated and become cloth, right? So there's my three planes just stacked above this cylinder. So when we look at this animation, it's actually very accurate, right? If anything, there's a little bit too much gap between the first cloth and the poly object. And that has to do with this collision solver here and what I had to set it to, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But when we look at the wide out view here, and then we look at the two zoomed in views, so this here is where the cloth is colliding with the box, and this here is this top edge around here with the top cylinder. So the cloth drops down, hits the cylinder, alright, starts to wrap around the cylinder, and we can see we've got nice cloth to cloth spacing. There's no real intersections. At the moment I'm limiting my subdivisions to only have one across and many along because that's the way we're folding the cloth, but I could put more subdivisions going acrossways, but for the purpose of this test I really wanted to understand that my cloth was doing what it was supposed to be doing. And we can see here that the cloth is falling down at some speed and colliding with the side of this box. So this is that zoomed in view down here, and we look after it's nicely folded itself around the cylinder and nothing's intersecting, and we can see that the cloth in this zoomed in view is acting very nicely and colliding against itself and not really intersecting. So understanding the cloth thickness is takes a little bit of playing around. I've done a lot here, but if we kind of look at tyFLow for a minute and we go down here and we see I'm at 1/24th time step. So that's the first thing that is important to note. That if I want really accurate cloth to cloth without intersections, I definitely need a higher time step. Now, what's the right amount of time step? I don't know if it applies the same number in every scenario, but you have to evaluate it as you're doing your thing. But in this instance, if I really wanted intersection-free cloth, then I had to go up. So then we also look at just understanding this thickness here. Alright. Now, the cloth doesn't have a thickness by default because it comes from the plane. And there's kind of three ways we can add thickness. We can actually put a shell modifier on the tyFLow. We could put a shell modifier on the plane, and I have another tutorial that talks about the pros and cons of this. And we can also add an internal shell in tyFLow itself where we create the cloth mesh. So understanding what's going on here, if we look at this inner and outer amount. So if I turn that off, now the cloth no longer has shell. So it doesn't have thickness, it's just the planes. And you can see the planes are spaced apart, and that's because we've set this thickness value here to 0.2. So there's going to be some mathematics involved when you're playing around with this. So here I'm setting an inner and outer amount to my cloth. Alright, I can also set material IDs, but in this instance I don't want to because I've set individual. Alright, but I could have a color set for the outside of the material, I could have a color set for the underside, and I could have a color set for the edge if I wanted to. Right. And then you would have to consider, if you wanted different colors for each one, you might have to put them in separate events and then build your flow. But that was a deviation. But now when we look, we've set an inner amount and an outer amount to our plane and given the illusion of thickness. So if we're going to add shell in any form somewhere, whether it's here, tyFLow, or the plane, right, then we're going to have to consider this thickness here. So 0.1 and 0.1 is 0.2, so if I want reasonably accurate cloth animations, I set the thickness here. So you can see that this 0.2 equals what I'm adding as a post-processing. I mean, this shell thing is a post-processing, right? So if you want the cloth to interact with each other and the objects in question, then these have to match. So if I go a little bit here thicker on my cloth, we should see those cloths slightly move away from each other, right? And you can see now we got more gap in between the cylinder, and we got a little bit of gap between each of the cloths because we've technically made the cutter thickness slightly bigger than what we've done the shell, right? And so if I go 0.1 here now and let it recalculate, then you can see the cloths are actually intersecting, and the red cloth is kind of disappearing. Well, the yellow cloth is disappearing most of the time because it's being squashed because we have an incorrect thickness value. So I hope this visualization here makes it clear on how we might want to control our cloth to cloth and cloth to object via a thickness. Now, a lot of time I do like to add thickness because I know cloth is really like a plane. A plane has no thickness, and also a single plane introduces texturing issues on one side, right? So you can see that we have a pretty good cloth to cloth when all the mass is correct. Now, when we look at this time step here, and at the moment I'm at 1/24th. Now, generally speaking, a lot of time I found 1/12 is pretty good for me. It does most of my stuff, even with cloth, with simple cloth. But you can see here, if we look in the top viewport here, you can see that the yellow and the red are definitely cutting into and intersecting into the blue on the curve of the cylinder, right? When we look at the collisions on the side, they don't look too bad, but I'm sure that if they're intersecting here on the top of the cylinder and we had a more complex folding setup, that they would probably intersect somewhere else. So that was when we took it down to 1/12. If we now go down to 1/8 and then see what goes down and let it recalculate, you can see that we definitely got a problem here, right? The yellow cloth has disappeared, right? And it's still maintaining a pretty good thing when it slaps against the side of this collision box, but there's definitely a issue in the top of the cylinder here, right? And that would probably also mean that there would be some issue when it comes to colliding with more complex shaped collision objects, right? And just to complete the exercise, and if we go down to something like quarter time step, we can see that things are going to go a little bit astray here, right? So time step matters when we're doing complex cloth to cloth collisions, and we're trying to not have intersections and have accurate behavior. So I'm just going to put this back up to 24, and this is when everything is really kind of perfect, right? And when we look at this self thickness setting here in the CUDA collision solver section of the cloth bind operator, this thickness here and self collision, that is only applicable to the cloth colliding against itself. Alright, so this setting here is for cloth colliding with itself. This setting here is giving an artificial thickness to each cloth that is created, and that thickness is used by the CUDA collision solver to determine cloth to cloth and cloth to poly. So just to finalize on this tutorial, I've disabled the top middle cloth and I've changed my middle collision box to a smaller box, which should allow the blue cloth to slap against itself. So if we look at this, a zoomed in view here, which is just below this, right? You can see it's right there. We can see that the cloth is actually intersecting and cutting through itself. So this is where this self collision comes into it, and we enable that, alright, and it's going to recalculate, and you can see that because we enabled self collision, it is now stopping itself and acting like cloth to cloth collision, right? If we take away the self thickness, I'm not sure what that's going to do by itself, but at this point it didn't seem to affect this outcome, but we can make a larger or adjusted self collision thickness. So if I say 0.5 here, which is much thicker than the cloth itself, then you can see that where the cloth collides, right, it's actually having an artificial thickness and keeping a gap between itself. So we can see here that this self thickness test, we can kind of manipulate our cloth, and remember this is just the cloth interacting with itself. This has nothing to do with two different cloths interacting, right? That's all up here for that. This is just for the cloth interacting with itself. So sometimes you're going to have to play with this self thickness to prevent, cloth intersecting on itself and passing through itself. And again, sometimes, as everything in tyFLow, the time step might have some influence over this, but that's the main difference between these two thicknesses. So I think we've covered this whole cloth thickness and collision thing pretty good. I hope we cleared, or at least we explained, or I explained, how we try and have reasonably accurate cloth to cloth or cloth to object animations by adding some thickness and proper collision to our cloths.